Major Reno was said to be in an excited condition on the hilltop, according to testimony from Lieutenant Winfield Edgerly at the Chicago Court of Inquiry, and was alleged to have fired his revolver at some Indians 1,000 yards away, or about 900 yards out of range. "Untrue," responded the major. "I did not fire my pistol." Whether he did or did not, he failed to give the impression that he was in control of himself or of his men. It is therefore a little surprising that 235 of these men, about 80% of the survivors, later petitioned the President and House of Representatives. With the enlisted men, the survivors of the battle on the heights of Little Horn River, on the 25th and 26th of June, 1876, of the 7th Regiment of Cavalry who subscribe our names to this petition, most earnestly solicit that the vacancies among the commissioned officers of our regiment, made by the slaughter of our brave, heroic, and now lamented Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer, and the other noble dead commissioned officers of our regiment who fell close by him on the bloody field, daring the savage demons to the last, be filled by the officers of the regiment only. That Major M. A. Reno, the our Lieutenant Colonel Vice Custer, killed. Captain F. W. Benteen our Major Vice Reno, promoted. This being a formal petition, Custer is referred to as Lieutenant Colonel instead of General. Although he had reached the rank of Major General during the Civil War, his appointment was brevet, meaning temporary. In 1866, when the Army was reorganized, he had been appointed Lieutenant Colonel of the 7th and was so designated in official communications. Socially speaking, however, he remained General Custer because it was customary to address an officer by the highest rank he had achieved. The petition continued, explaining that the men understood such promotions would violate established military procedure, but begged to solicit a deviation from the usual rule in recognition of their belief that only the actions of Reno and Benteen had saved them all from death. Shadows creep across this document. Major E. S. Luce, former superintendent of the Custer Battlefield National Monument, noted various irregularities. Signatures of men known to have been illiterate, signatures of men on detached service, signatures of 3 men whose names could not be found on any regimental roster, etc. In 1954 Major Luce submitted a photostat of the petition and some other documentary material to the FBI, requesting an analysis of the handwriting. The FBI answered that no definite conclusion could be reached because of the limited amount of comparable handwriting. Nevertheless, variations were noted in the signatures listed below and the corresponding known signatures, which suggest in all probability that the signatures on the petition are forgeries. The FBI listed 79 dubious signatures, and in the opinion of Major Luce these closely resembled the handwriting of Joseph McCurry, 1st Sergeant of Benteen's H Company. Therefore it has been argued that Benteen concocted this petition, persuaded and or coerced many enlisted men into signing it, and instructed his devoted sergeant to pad the document with 79 more. This may sound unlikely. Indeed it does sound unlikely. But devoted subordinates do sometimes fiddle with records, as Americans learn once in a while to their astonishment and dismay. Whether or not the petition was loaded, it accomplished nothing. General Sherman replied, "The judicious and skillful conduct of Major Reno and Captain Benteen is appreciated, but the promotions caused by General Custer's death have been made by the President and confirmed by the Senate, therefore this petition cannot be granted." Sherman's brisk, courteous response implies no lack of faith in Reno, but many officers were less politic. Brigadier C. A. Woodruff, who had been a lieutenant in Gibbon's column, corresponded with historian Cyrus Brady in 1904 and had this to say: "I conversed with most of the officers of that command at one time or another, while in the field, and nearly all were very pronounced in their severe criticism of Reno. Major Reno was not the only one to break down. Benteen stated that upon reaching the crest of the bluff he observed Miles Moylan, the gallantly mustached captain of Troop A, blubbering like a whipped urchin, tears coursing down his cheeks. Benteen took command, at least temporarily. Although Reno's behavior will be argued as long as the Little Bighorn is remembered, there has not been much controversy about this moon-faced pipe-smoking Southerner. Some, but not much. A Chicago Times reporter wrote of Benteen, "He has a very juvenile face and head, set on a most masculine body. To look at him casually, he might be mistaken for an overgrown drummer boy. In not a single photograph does he look formidable, not even very military. He appears placid, gentle, benevolent, with feminine lips and prematurely white hair. Only after contemplating that orotund face for a while does one begin to perceive something rather less accommodating. Embedded in that fleshy face are the expressionless agate eyes of a killer. One might compare them to the eyes of John Wesley Hardin or Billy the Kid. Now, this sinister absence of expression could be nothing more than a result of myopia, a condition afflicting him after the Oklahoma winter campaign of 1868 to 1869 years when he lent his protective goggles to a regimental surgeon. Still, in Civil War photographs he has almost that same look. His family background suggests affluence. During the 18th century the Benteens emigrated from Holland, settling in Baltimore, and were so conservative that the American Revolution could not shake their loyalty to the crown. They became music publishers. Stephen Foster was a client. Sometime in the 1830s Frederick's father moved to Virginia where he owned 2 slaves, according to the 1840 census, and he could afford to enroll Fred at a private academy. Yet all of this is rather misleading. The elder Benteen painted houses and worked as a storekeeper selling glass, hardware, and paint. As for owning slaves, in Virginia at that time it was not unusual. In 1849 he moved to St. Louis, perhaps drawn by the wake of the California gold rush, and in St. Louis young Fred went to work as might be expected, painting houses and signs. When the Civil War erupted Fred sympathized with the Union, which is surprising if one considers the family's Southern heritage. A natural assumption would be that he detested slavery, but apparently he felt more troubled by the idea of Southern politicians manipulating the war to their personal advantage. In 1897 he told a reporter from the Atlanta Journal that slavery was not the issue, and he went on to say that he never had known an abolitionist in the Union Army. Another factor must have been a young lady from Philadelphia, Catherine Norman, a vehement Unionist whom he would later marry. Whatever the intellectual persuasion, he seems to have been emotionally moved by a Federal defeat at Wilson's Creek near Springfield. He might have participated in this fight. He might only have observed it. He later claimed to have been a spectator, which is improbable. The battle took place in a wooded area 12 miles from town, and nobody with any brain strolls into the woods with a picnic basket to watch a battle. He almost certainly fought with the Union, perhaps as a civilian. Charles K. Mills, who thoroughly studied the incident, thought Benteen might have joined a column which broke and ran, and he ran with them. Later, to excuse the shame of this, he claimed he was not involved. If such a scenario is correct, it might be the only time in his life that Benteen ran from a fight. His record is studded with citations for gallantry. What seems beyond dispute is that he felt shocked by the cowardly retreat of Union troops. On September 1, 1861, he accepted a lieutenancy in Bowen's battalion, which subsequently evolved into the 10th Missouri. This treasonous act enraged his father, who disinherited him and prayed aloud that a relative loyal to the South would kill him. The elder Benteen allegedly remarked, "I hope the first goddamned bullet gets you." This intransigent old loyalist went to work on a Mississippi steamboat called the Fairplay, which supplied the Confederacy. On August 18, 1862, It was captured by a Union flotilla that included 2 companies of Bowen's Missourians, among them Captain Frederick Benteen. The civilian crew of the Fairplay was taken to Helena, Arkansas, and there released all except Chief Engineer T.C. Benteen, who was locked up for the duration. The immediate question, then, is why Benteen the Elder was not turned loose. The judge advocate at Helena and the provost marshal both were good friends of Benteen the Younger, which establishes a most unusual coincidence. Mills, who has preserved the features of this articulate and complex individual as meticulously as they are apt to be preserved after such a long time, believes that Fred Benteen secretly conspired with federal authorities to guarantee his father's safety for the rest of the war. In custody, the old man would be safe. Young Fred served the North with considerable distinction. The list of skirmishes, full-scale engagements, sieges, raids, and captures in which he participated requires several inches of type in his biography. Bolivar, Pea Ridge, Batesville, Kickapoo Bottom, Milliken's Bend, Pleasant Hill, Little Osage, Montevallo, Greenville, Selma, Columbus, etc. Cited for gallant and meritorious service. Steadily promoted. Recommended for brevet rank of Brigadier General on June 6, 1865, although this recommendation was not accepted. Then came the Indian fights. Saline, Washita, Little Bighorn, Nez Perce campaign. From the beginning of his association with the 7th Cavalry he mistrusted and disliked Custer. He was 5 years older, and no man enjoys subservience to his junior, but Benteen's antipathy was nourished by something else. He greatly admired a 3rd Cavalry commandant whose division was assigned to Custer in 1864. This historically insignificant change of command meant a lot to Benteen. From then on he resented the prominent young general. They met on January 29, 1867, at Fort Riley. Benteen was disgusted by Custer's pretense. At various times he had gotten to know a number of generals, he said, but never before was he subjected to such bragging. Custer invited him back for a little diamante poker the next day. 5 or 6 officers sat in on this amiable gathering. For a while, as Benteen later wrote to the celebrated photographer D.F. Barry, Custer clawed everything in sight. Elizabeth stood behind him with her hands resting on his shoulders or in his bosom, by which Benteen evidently meant that she slipped a hand through the buttons of his tunic. She watched her husband rake in the chips and gently reprimanded him, saying, "Now you must give them their money back." Not long after she went to bed, 2 of the gamblers dropped out and Custer proposed raising the ante to $2.50. The survivors played until dawn, at which time Benteen had to quit because he was officer of the day. On several occasions, he wrote to Barry, Custer left the table and visited his wife, to get the sinews of war to prosecute the game, and when reveille sounded, I had all the money. Not only did Benteen have everything on the table, he pocketed an IOU for $150 from Captain Weir. This poker game, after he had been at Fort Riley just 3 days, did not win him any new friends. Nobody likes a winner. Besides, Weir was a close friend of the general, a member of the so-called Custer gang. Nor could he get along with Major Reno. Benteen attributed this to an argument at a post-traders establishment where, for some reason that is not now clear, he called Reno a son of a bitch and slapped his face. In regard to this, and quite a few other disputes, Professor Edgar Stewart has described Benteen's preeminent characteristic as jealousy of and hostility to almost everybody and everything. Such a comment makes him easy to remember, but of course it is an oversimplification. 1 or 2 vivid strokes with a pen do not delineate a man. General E. A. Garlington, in those days a 7th Cavalry lieutenant, called him proud and vain, not a steady drinker but one who occasionally started hoisting a cup and did not quit for several days, during which time he became abusive and insulting to those whom he disliked or disapproved of. He was much liked by most of the officers in the regiment and they took care of him in such periods. The cause of these drinking bouts seems to be related to his wife, Catherine, who was not very strong and who did not belong on a frontier. He called her Kate or Kitty, logical diminutives. He also called her Pinky and Goose, names that might be simply affectionate or could have originated during some private moment. However, he very often referred to her as Frabby, Frabble, Frabellina, and at least once as Frabellina of Gay Street, which is, to say the least, uncommon. It might be the name of a dramatic or fictional character from the time of their courtship. She lost 4 of their 5 children following the music of the cavalry trumpet, as Benteen expressed it. All 4 died of spinal meningitis, a disease from which he himself suffered, so he said. If indeed he was afflicted with the tubercular variety, as opposed to influenzal meningitis, he could have transmitted the disease. And if this was so, as Mills points out, if Benteen knew that he himself had caused the deaths of those 4 children, it must be regarded as an important clue to his personality. In 1887 he was court-martialed for unmilitary behavior of various sorts. Charge first. Drunk on duty, in violation of the 38th Article of War. Specification first. In this, that Major Frederick W. Benteen, 9th Cavalry, when in command of the post of Fort Duchesne, Utah, was found drunk. That at Fort Duchesne, Utah, on or about the 25th day of September, 1886. Specifications 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th and 6th were identical, only the dates changed. While in command of Fort Duchesne he was found drunk on or about September 27th, October 10th, November 10th, November 11th, November 12th. November must have been a difficult month. Charge second. Conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. Specification. In this, that Major Frederick W. Benteen, 9th U.S. Cavalry, did, when in command of the post of Fort Duchesne, Utah, conduct himself in a scandalous manner, in the post-trader's store using obscene and profane language, taking off his clothes, to quarrel with citizens, and exposing his person. This, to the dishonor and disrepute of the military service, at Fort Duchesne, Utah, on or about the 11th day of November, 1886. To each charge Benteen pleaded not guilty. His trial began February 2, 1887. Mr. S. D. Cotton, citizen, being duly sworn, testified that on the infamous 11th of November he and Mr. L. Johnson walked into the sutler's store and encountered Colonel Benteen, his brevet rank at the time. Colonel Benteen had been drinking freely, said Mr. Cotton, and got into a quarrel with Mr. Johnson, using some pretty hard language. Nevertheless, Benteen insisted upon buying drinks for these 2 citizens. Mr. Johnson then attempted to return the compliment and tossed out $1, whereupon Benteen said, "I believe you denied being a Mormon, Mr. Johnson." To which Mr. Johnson replied that he was mistaken. "You are a goddamned liar," Benteen said, "you did deny it to me. Some think I came here to fight Indians, but I came here to fight Mormons." Furthermore, according to Mr. Cotton's testimony, Colonel Benteen said, "I'll make the Star-Spangled Banner float over all your heads before I get through with you." The 2 citizens then walked out of the sutler's establishment. About an hour later Benteen located them and tried to apologize, but it did not go very well. "I think you are both goddamned Mormons," he said, "and the Mormons are a set of goddamned sons of bitches." This enraged Mr. Cotton, who got ready to fight. He took off his overcoat and called Benteen a liar, at which Benteen peeled down to his shirt, threw off his suspenders, rolled up his sleeves, and was ready to go when a lieutenant managed to separate them. He kept on abusing me, Mr. Cotton testified, calling me all the goddamned sons of bitches he could lay his tongue to, until I left. I realized, of course, that he was very drunk, or he would not talk to me that way, for he had always treated me as well as any gentleman I could wish to meet. But he was very drunk then. I saw him that afternoon, but did not speak to him. They was taking him home. The court asked about the state of the accused man's clothing during this altercation. He had his cap off, Mr. Cotton answered, his coat off down to his shirt sleeves, and his breeches down halfway over his hips. He was staggering around as drunk as a man could be and stand on his pegs. Mr. L. Johnson then came before the court. Being duly sworn, he testified that his name was Lycurgus Johnson, resident of Ashley, Uintah County, Utah, whose occupation was varied. Did he know the accused? Yes. Had he seen the accused at the trader's store on or about November 11th? Yes. Being asked to state anything unusual that occurred on this date, he verified the testimony of his friend Mr. Cotton, including the remark about the Star-Spangled Banner. He stated also that he had observed Benteen later in the day. I see them taking him home. I don't know whether it was home. It was in a direction southeast. J. W. Vanderhoof, citizen, carpenter, and resident of Sidney, Nebraska, testified for the prosecution that he had observed the accused staggering about, using language that no gentleman would use, unless under the influence of liquor. Mr. Vanderhoof testified that citizens who entered the trader's establishment were ordered by the accused to hit the breeze. He told the court that the accused had gotten into an argument with Mr. Isaac Cummins who, upon being ordered to leave, stepped behind a coal stove. The accused discovered him, said Vanderhoof, and pointed a finger to him, and said, "There stands the son of a bitch behind the stove." He said, "Boys," speaking to no one specially, "give me a revolver and I'll make the son of a bitch of a Mormon pull his freight." Mr. William Tice, citizen, resident of Fort Duchesne, who gave his occupation as roustabout, also testified for the prosecution. Did he recognize the accused? Yes. Did he see the accused on or about November 11th? Yes. I seen him down at the place where I am employed. At that time I was cooking for the post trader. The place where I saw him was down at the cookhouse. Being asked to relate the circumstances, Mr. Tice stated that shortly after 5 o'clock Major Benteen arrived for supper. He was intoxicated. Did the witness hold any conversation with the accused? Yes, the accused asked the witness his name. Upon being told William Tice, the accused continued to ask the same question. I answered him 3 or 4 times. He was almost through his supper, then he fell from his chair. Whether it was done by accident, I don't know. For supper, I gave him eggs. They were boiled soft, and they run down his beard. After the accused fell off his chair, inquired the court, what did the accused do? Mr. Tice stated that the accused broke part of his pants open. I presume it was by accident as this was the first I saw of it. He fell on the floor and, as I say before, the front part of his pants unbuttoned, or broke open. He did not get right up. He laid there for a matter of 2 or 3 minutes. How did the witness happen to observe the disordered condition of the pants of the accused? Mr. Tice replied that it would be natural to observe this. Did the accused at any time improperly expose any part of his person? Not that I know of. No, sir. A transcript of the court-martial notes that the accused declined to cross-examine this witness. The court also heard testimony from a certain Mrs. Bailey, who was chatting with several other ladies in Colonel Benteen's tent when he approached in an intoxicated condition, addressing her as follows: "Your husband must have a hell of a time with you." Mrs. Bailey responded by asking what he meant. He next made some reference to her eyes. His words were repeated differently by different witnesses, after which there seems to be no doubt about what he did. He stepped outside and pissed on the tent very close to where the ladies were sitting. "We all heard it," testified Captain J. A. Olmsted. Miss Violet Norman was called to testify on behalf of the accused. Being asked if she recognized the accused, she replied that she did. He was her uncle. Being directly questioned by the accused as to his condition at the time of the reputed insult to Mrs. Bailey, Miss Norman answered, "You had been drinking some, was rather talkative, but was not in my opinion drunk." Being asked to give her recollection of the incident, she stated to the court, "Colonel Benteen was joking with Mrs. Bailey about her eyes, and I remember his having said to her that any woman with such eyes must be a holy terror. I think that was the only thing said about the matter, and was said in pleasantry, and taken as such by Mrs. Bailey, for they had been joking and were joking for some time after that." Did Colonel Benteen escort Mrs. Bailey to and from supper? He did. What were the relations between Mrs. Bailey and the accused? They were very pleasant. Mrs. Bailey came out almost every day to walk with me, and we were very frequently joined by Colonel Benteen, and I never saw anything that was contrary. At the time of the alleged insult, did anything occur which would offend the taste of the most fastidious person? There was nothing of the kind. The testimony of Miss Violet Norman was read aloud by the judge advocate, and Miss Norman pronounced it correctly recorded. The most eloquent defense of the accused seems to have come from Benteen himself in the form of a lengthy document entitled Exhibit H, being further statements of F. W. Benteen, submitted in writing. Much of it is dull, but now and then, aggrieved by all these slanderous insinuations, he responds with fairly senatorial wrath. In regard to Captain Olmsted, "Why, gentlemen, this man Olmsted broods over fancies until he believes them to be facts, and then he propagates them as facts. This is well known in the 9th Cavalry, and such a man's testimony is not allowed to be impeached by this court. This officer is not prejudiced against me, but when asked whether he is, says, no, and then proceeds to inject all the virus that his little syringe will hold by dragging in an occurrence as antique as the spring of 1884, which, if the facts were told by disinterested witnesses, would redound to my credit, and he was known as a Benteen man. Thank God, gentlemen, there are not many such, or I could truly say save me from my friends. I should think it an insult for a man like that to take my part, for he has not a single idea of his own. They are all reflected. Benteen is not through with Olmsted. He summarizes a conversation alleged to have taken place between himself and a Mr. Lorenzo Hatch, during which he, Benteen, told Olmsted to keep his damned nose out of the business. Gentlemen, I know they referred to his nose, or his damned nose, but I can inform him of one thing, that I will pull it for him if I ever hear of his meddling with anything that concerns me or mine again. This man is a dangerous man, and I regret that I did not find it out sooner. Concerning the charge of drunkenness on a particular day, Benteen remembers it well. He was in the sutler's tent, and though I had drank some during the afternoon, principally ginger ale, I had caught cold, my spine being bent, so that I could not stand erect, and on going towards home, I called Lute Steyer's attention to the fact, asking him if I did not appear somewhat as the man in Joe Jefferson's Rip Van Winkle, who is carrying the keg up to the skittle players in the Catskills. As for those damaging witnesses S. D. Cotton and Lycurgus Johnson, they are not worthy of belief. Benteen knows them. A pity the court does not. I've heard enough more of them to make one's hair stand on end, and one of the stories was that Johnson let his poor old mother drown, as she was an encumbrance, but had ample time to save the horses while crossing a swollen river. Oh yes, he continues, admonishing those who must decide his fate. I know too well that subtle poison has been diligently and assiduously poured into the ears of the members of this court by my detractors. And in a rolling summation which opens with the first shot fired at Fort Sumter, he explains how he came to be where he is. To a Southerner whose father and family were Calhounists of the ultra stamp, where states' rights and nullification were among the earliest remembered words, it became no easy matter to answer the Union call, to rush with fixed bayonet upon brother, father, home, friends, and companions. Such, gentlemen, was the predicament I was in, living in Missouri when the rally round the flag was being sounded in clarion tones by the loyal people of the country. The fruit of the Civil War he called a harvest of barren regrets, although the Union prevailed. Afterward he felt obligated to provide a home for his widowed sister and her 3 infant daughters, as well as a home for the widow and 3 children of his brother who had fallen from a scaffolding in 1882. His aged Yankee-hating father, too, depended on him. So he wrote in 1887, reminding the court that those small children now were grown, with children of their own. And their little children clamor to rest on the knees of their soldier uncle, and every night from their little bedsides the prayers of those prattlers are offered up to the divine being to protect, care for and bless their dear old soldier uncle, and that their childish wishes will be heeded in due time, by our Maker, the great Grand Master, I verily believe with them. I truly know that there is nothing so dear to all their childish hearts, as the wish to be just such a man as they think their dear old uncle to be. To no avail, this majestic defense. The court did not find him guilty of indecent exposure, nor of drunkenness on 3 of the specified days, but of substantial drunkenness, as well as conduct unbecoming an officer and gentleman. He was guilty. And the court does therefore sentence him, Major Frederick W. Benteen, 9th U.S. Cavalry, to be dismissed from the United States military service. A document superscribed Headquarters Department of the Platte, dated March 11, 1887, states that the proceedings, findings, and sentence have been approved and are forwarded to the President with a recommendation that if, in view of Major Benteen's past record, clemency should be extended to him, he should be somehow disciplined for his insubordinate and disrespectful language, and his unsoldier-like conduct, as shown in these proceedings, indicating, as they do, that he is sadly in need of such discipline. Signed, George Crook, Brigadier General. Crook's respectful hint that clemency be extended was echoed by his superior and former West Point roommate, Little Phil Sheridan. President Cleveland took their word for it. Benteen was suspended from rank and duty for 1 year at half pay. He served this penitential year in Atlanta, where he had been stationed at the conclusion of the Civil War and where he had decided to live. On April 27, 1888, he reported for duty at Fort Niobrara, Nebraska, but 3 days later he applied for a medical discharge. The Army granted his request because of a bad back, defective vision, and frequent micturition, all attributed to injuries during his period of service. After getting out of the Army he retired to Atlanta, where he lived in reasonable comfort with his wife and their son, dividing his time between a farm and a cottage in town, writing a few memoirs, enjoying the friendship of such luminaries as Joel Chandler Harris. He himself was something of a celebrity, though regarded as little more than a carpetbagger by the Atlanta nobility. He did not mind talking to reporters, but he would not discuss the great battle. The Atlanta Journal commented that there was nothing he disliked more than publicity, and if it were left to him none of his valorous deeds would be handed down to posterity. In 1890, despite his scandalous behavior at Fort Duchesne, he was awarded the brevet rank of brigadier for gallant and meritorious service in 2 battles, one as thoroughly forgotten as the other is famous. Canyon Creek and the Little Bighorn. 8 years later, on June 17th, he was paralyzed by a stroke. 5 days after that he died. Among the pallbearers were the mayor of Atlanta, the governor of Georgia, and a vice president of Coca-Cola. In 1902 he was exhumed and reburied at Arlington. Once he wrote to a former 7th Cavalry private with whom he had served at the Little Bighorn. "I've been a loser in a way, all my life by rubbing a bit against the angles or hair of folks, instead of going with their whims. But I couldn't go otherwise, 'twould be against the grain of myself." The same undoubtedly could be said for Reno, and for the 7th Cavalry Commandant himself. All three rubbed against the hair because they could not do otherwise. So it happened that the 7th's 3 ranking officers created a triangle with Custer at the apex while his subordinates held themselves apart at the lower corners. Why Major Reno and Captain Benteen did not get along is puzzling. Their mutual antipathy lacked the virulence that inflamed their relationships with Custer, but in spite of all they had in common they could not, or would not, march in step. One thing the captain might have resented was the fact that Reno attended West Point while he himself did not. And he probably knew about Reno's miserable West Point record, which must have added to the contempt he felt. Reno was scheduled to graduate with the class of 1855 but twice derailed himself with excessive demerits and did not make it until 1857. During those 6 years he picked up 1,031 demerits, an academy record. At the opposite extreme, a few cadets have graduated without a single black mark, the most illustrious being, as one might guess, Robert E. Lee, class of 29. Reno got demerits easily, almost deliberately. A button on his tunic was unfastened. A trace of lint clung to the bore of his rifle. He arrived at formation several seconds late. He carved his initials on a tree. While on guard duty he decided to sing. By normal standards such crimes are not heinous, but Reno was in the army, where normal standards do not prevail. Accordingly he was busted, saved from permanent expulsion once by the grace of Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who himself had accumulated 137 demerits during his 4th year as a cadet. Busted again, barely saved by a reduction of charges, Reno emerged from the nest 20th in a fledgling class of 38. This was not good, but during his career with the 7th he must have reflected that it was better than the record of his commanding officer. George Armstrong Custer, class of 61, graduated last. Reno's record also was superior to that of his closest friend at West Point, James McNeill Whistler, who piled up demerits with heroic aplomb and concluded one examination by defining silicon as a gas. Whistler reputedly said to Reno some years afterward that if silicon indeed had been a gas he probably would have stayed in the army and become a major general. And Reno said yes, but then nobody would ever have heard of his mother. That must have been one of the cleverest things Reno ever said. Unlike Custer and Benteen, with their very different styles, he seems humorless. There is no levity in that dark face. From the start, almost from the day he entered West Point, he radiates an aura of misfortune. It never diminishes. During the Civil War, when he led a charge against Fitzhugh Lee near the Rappahannock, his horse went down, pinning him underneath. He was cited for gallantry and recommended for brevet promotion from captain to major, but the gods always poisoned their gifts to Reno. The accident resulted in a severe hernia. After the war he was sent to West Point as an instructor. This ought to have been good news, considering various alternatives, but at West Point, after 8 years as a cavalry officer, he was assigned to teach infantry tactics. Thus far it sounds like bad luck, but henceforth Reno seems increasingly responsible for the necklace of tin cans he wore. He protested the infantry assignment by writing to Superintendent George Washington Cullom. Cullom thought this presumptuous and requested the War Department to relieve Captain Reno of his duties at West Point. He therefore was ordered to New Orleans. Again he protested by writing to the Adjutant General, which further blemished his reputation as an obedient soldier. In 1866, convinced that he deserved promotion and that the way to accomplish this was to let important people get a look at him, he visited the capital. Nothing happened. He invoked the aid of a senator. Then he wrote a letter to President Johnson. As a result, having antagonized various parties, including the Secretary of War, he was shipped to Fort Vancouver, Washington Territory, about as far from the throne as a soldier could be sent in those days. During the summer of 1869 he was finally promoted to major in the regular army and assigned to the 7th Cavalry at Fort Leavenworth. So to the Kansas prairie he went with his wife and son. There the gods offered him to Custer. 5 years later, while he was afield in Montana, a courier delivered a telegram containing the news that his wife had unexpectedly died. Reno turned over the unit to his senior captain and rode all night to Fort Benton, where he sent a telegram requesting permission to attend his wife's funeral. Headquarters replied, "While fully sympathizing with your affliction, the department commander feels it is imperative to decline to grant you leave. You must return to your command." His wife came from a wealthy family, but they despised him and saw to it that he never got a dime. In 1876, after the Little Bighorn defeat, he returned to Fort Lincoln, but presently was given command of a wretched stronghold 30 miles south of Fargo called Fort Abercrombie. Here he ran afoul of a captain's wife, Mrs. Emmeline Bell. Her reputation was not good. Perhaps she was maligned. Today it is impossible to know. Reno himself, justifiably or not, compared her to a spoiled egg. How intimate they were is a matter of academic dispute. That he slid closer to her than he should have while the captain was absent is beyond doubt. That he accomplished much, if anything, seems very questionable. Whatever did or did not happen, his behavior caused gossip. He might have eased out of this delicate situation except for the presence of an Episcopal missionary and longtime friend of the Bells, Reverend Richard Wainwright, who lodged at the captain's house. It appears that Wainwright was outraged by what he heard and persuaded the captain to file charges of immoral conduct. This being done, Reno was ordered to relinquish command of Fort Abercrombie and deliver himself up to his superiors at St. Paul, there to stand trial. Under provisions of Article of War 61, it was specified that in disregard of his honor and duty Reno did visit the quarters of Captain Bell and there take improper and insulting liberties with the wife of the said Captain Bell, by taking both her hands in his own, and attempting to draw her person up close to his own. This to the scandal and disgrace of the military service, at Fort Abercrombie, D.T., on or about the 18th day of December, 1876. 3 or 4 days later, no doubt convinced that he had made a little progress, Captain Bell being yet away from the fort, Reno slipped an arm around Mrs. Bell's waist. This to the scandal and disgrace. On Christmas he was not invited to a party given by Mrs. Bell. He was the only officer who did not get an invitation, and he was overheard exclaiming to Mr. John Hazelhurst, post-trader, "This means war. Mrs. Bell has thrown down the gauntlet, and I will take it up." Perhaps these people do not know the power of a commanding officer. by which it was understood that he had in mind to revenge himself upon the said Mrs. Bell for her failure to invite him to the social gathering aforesaid. 5 days after that, rounding out a disastrous year, he forbade Reverend Wainwright to hold religious services on the post. When the missionary demanded an explanation, Reno told him a member of the garrison had objected. But instead of leaving it there, Reno went on to suggest that Wainwright and Mrs. Bell were taking advantage of the captain's absence. And on the very last day of 1876 he did maliciously attempt and endeavored to annoy and humiliate the wife of Captain James M. Bell by refusing to permit her to play the organ. Evidently he had arranged some sort of truce with the preacher because religious services were authorized and she was engaged to play. But at the last moment he sent a note forbidding her participation. Reverend Wainwright could preach, but if Mrs. Bell played the organ he would put a stop to it. All of this very much to the scandal and disgrace of the military. And there were charges concerning his behavior at Fort Lincoln, upon which he was not tried. There, according to the addendum, on or about September 26, when said post was exposed and liable to attack from Sioux Indians, he, Major Marcus Reno, did become drunk. And did, by malicious and insulting comments, provoke a rough-and-tumble fistfight with First Lieutenant John A. Manley, 20th Infantry, during which struggle the combatants rolled around on the floor of the officers' clubroom in the slops and filth covered by spittle and the spilling of liquor over said floor, in the presence of civilians and junior officers. To the disgrace of all, he did furthermore attempt to provoke a duel with First Lieutenant Charles A. Varnum, causing pistols to be sent for, and upon being threatened with arrest he responded, "Who in hell are you?" or words to that effect. These allegations, plus 2 or 3 others, were forwarded to Colonel Samuel Sturgis, de jure commandant of the 7th. Sturgis had not led his regiment against the Indians because he was stationed temporarily in St. Louis as superintendent of the mounted recruiting service. Thus it was Lieutenant Colonel Custer who led the troops that summer. Sturgis forwarded these complaints about Reno as he was required to do, but he was also expected to evaluate them, and he refused to approve them. They appear now with a bad grace, and do not carry with them the idea that they proceed from conscientious motives. I was not at Fort Lincoln at the time of the alleged occurrences, but am credibly informed that the occasion was the return of the raid from the field and the opening of the clubroom at Lincoln, and that the debauchery was pretty general. Even so, it was another tin can around Reno's neck. A lucky man might have eluded the charges filed by Captain Bell, either through the liquidity of his tongue or the glow of his guiding star, but Marcus Reno was not lucky. His star flickered. The St. Paul court recommended that he be dismissed from the army. President Hayes, taking into account Reno's 20 years of meritorious service, reduced this punishment to suspension without pay for 2 years. It did not take him long to get in trouble again. Restored to active duty, stationed at Fort Meade near the Black Hills, he felt himself overcome with passion for Colonel Sturgis' daughter, 20-year-old Ella. By this time Reno was a paunchy, middle-aged alcoholic, so it is not likely that the choleric colonel enjoyed the sight of him beaming at Ella. Then too, young Jack Sturgis, the colonel's son, was killed at the Little Bighorn, and a great many people considered Reno responsible for the disaster. Sturgis himself blamed Custer. Nevertheless, Reno must have been associated in Sturgis' mind with the death of his son. Under the very best circumstances he probably did not care for the presence of the dark-faced major. On the evening of August 3rd, having been invited to supper at the home of post-trader W.S. Fanshawe, Reno got drunk, disgustingly drunk according to Mrs. Fanshawe. So drunk that he got the hiccups, she later said, and she feared he might become ill. On the evening of August 8th in the billiard room of the officers' club he got drunk, knocked some money out of the bartender's hand, punched a hole through a window with a chair, and fell down 3 times on the way home. October 25th was another big evening in the billiard room. He lost approximately $300 playing against Lieutenant William Nicholson, after which they got into a fight. Reno hit Nicholson with a cue, which broke. Nicholson grabbed Reno by the throat and flung him to the floor. Lieutenant James Pettit intervened, threatening them both with arrest. Colonel Sturgis ordered Reno confined to quarters until this very serious matter could be resolved. He was permitted to leave his quarters only for exercise. Then came the dreadful night of November 10th. While circling the parade ground on his evening constitutional, Reno walked by the colonel's house. He observed a light in the parlor. He approached. He raised himself on a ledge, he looked in the window, and he discovered sweet Ella, presumably alone. He tapped on the glass. Ella jumped. He then perceived that she was not alone. Mrs. Sturgis also was in the parlor, and Ella cried out in manifest alarm. "Mama, it is Major Reno." Mrs. Sturgis called to her husband, who was upstairs in bed, or almost in bed, and moments later the colonel flew out of the house with his suspenders flapping, brandishing a cane. Reno decided this would not be an appropriate moment to explain the situation. He retreated to his quarters. There he was soon confronted by the regimental adjutant, who demanded to know what he had been doing at the colonel's house. Next morning he wrote an apologetic note to Mrs. Sturgis. He understood that his troubles were now compounded, because he kept a draft of this note, which has a few words misspelled. November 11, 1879. Whatever others may say or think, I do not wish to be misunderstood by you, and I write this that you may appreciate what motives actuated me when I stopped to look through your window. It has been my habit since an arrest to walk on favorable nights on the pathway in front of officers' quarters 2 or 3 times for exercise. On the evening in question I saw your daughter in complete toilet through the window, and it was such a picture that I said to myself, can there be any harm in looking upon it? No one will know it, and in my loneliness and those of the past, I felt myself impatient to resist the temptation. I sincerely ask your pardon for all that does not seem to you as innocent, for I do assure you, if not guiltless, the fault was in the judgment and not heart. Of course I would like you to show this to E. It was not enough. At least it failed to mollify the exasperated colonel, because Reno found himself saddled with another charge, that he did, in the darkness and at a late hour in the evening, surreptitiously enter the side grounds adjoining the private residence or quarters of his commanding officer, Colonel S. D. Sturgis, 7th Cavalry, and did peer into, etc. They brought him to the rail again, charged with conduct unbecoming an officer and gentleman. On November 28 he stood before a general court-martial. The presiding officer was Colonel William Henry Wood, who had once disciplined him at West Point. Another member of this court was a good friend of Sturgis. Another was Lieutenant Colonel Elmer Otis, whom Reno had known as a cadet, which should have been reassuring. Unfortunately they did not like each other, and in a fit of temper Reno had once told Otis that instead of attending the academy he should have gone to cooking school. In regard to the Fanshawe supper, Reno testified that he was not the only one drinking. In fact, he said, 5 people had shared that bottle. Furthermore, nobody except Mrs. Fanshawe considered his behavior disgusting. As for that rowdy evening at the club, all the witnesses agree that it was a frolic. That the chair was thrown or tossed when I was sober. Is there anything here to attach disorderly conduct to? Concerning the business with Lieutenant Nicholson, he brought that on himself by repeated insults. I struck him under great provocation with a billiard cue. Can there be anything criminal in that? Could I, as an officer and gentleman, have acted otherwise? And about peeking into the Sturgis parlor, it was an act of pure admiration. He would rather cut off his right arm than disturb one single hair of sweet Ella's head. He might have escaped with cursory punishment had it not been for this final indiscretion. because there was testimony in his favor. But that unhappy swarthy face at the window had alarmed Colonel Sturgis' daughter more than words could tell. Lieutenant Baldwin Spillman, witness for the prosecution, testified that he saw Reno walk away from the Sturgis home that night, and he saw Ella very soon thereafter, her features considerably distorted. Ella herself claimed that the face at the window had left her paralyzed. She had been so frightened, she told the court, that she could hardly speak. Major Reno looked excited, pale, and desperate. Their eyes met for at least 6 seconds, and her first impression was that she was going to be shot. Benteen was called to the stand. Although he felt contemptuous of Reno, he testified on Reno's behalf. He had read the note of apology to Mrs. Sturgis before it was sent, and he considered it an honest explanation of the Major's otherwise inexplicable behavior. The Major was, he believed, dead in love with the young lady. The court found Reno guilty as charged, only modifying the language somewhat, and recommended dismissal from service. Despite this verdict, 5 of the 7 judges urged clemency. General Terry thought the sentence excessive and joined the petition for clemency. Sherman, higher up, gave a similar opinion. But this time President Hayes did not feel magnanimous. After 23 years in uniform, Reno was dishonorably discharged. Then it was steeply downhill. He had no idea what to do. He could not get a job. He borrowed money from his son. He moved to Washington, where he met a government clerk named Isabella Ray, and in January of 1884 they got married. After a few months she left him. Finally, the Bureau of Pensions hired him as an examiner. He thought people might like to know about the Little Bighorn, so he advised the New York Weekly Press that he still had his diary written on the battlefield lying in the grass within scent of the dead horses, and he wondered if the editor might be interested in a contribution. When the editor said yes, Reno mailed him an account of the fight. It was rejected. In Nashville, his son married a whiskey heiress, Miss Itikini, but Reno did not attend the wedding. He explained that he was too busy, which was untrue. He could not afford train fare to Nashville. Such indigence must have been corrosive because, according to one biographer, who does not provide much documentation, he was a descendant of Philippe François Reno, who accompanied Lafayette to America in 1777. This distinguished ancestor was rewarded by the United States with tracts of land said to have been worth $400 million by the 19th century, but litigation prevented Reno from tasting this marvelous pie. Another biographer states that he was a descendant of French Huguenots named Reno, who fled to Virginia in the early 18th century, and no reference is made to prodigious wealth. $400 million or not, his first wife unquestionably was rich, while he himself could not buy a ticket to Nashville. His star glittered darkly until the end. He developed cancer of the tongue and died after an operation at Providence Hospital. On March 29, 1889, the Washington Evening Star took notice. Reno in this city, died, Marcus A. Reno, late Major and Brevet Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army. General Custer's widow, who lived into her 90s, held him responsible for what happened at the Little Bighorn. In 1926 she was invited to Montana for the 50th anniversary, at which time a monument to the hapless major would be unveiled. She answered with a letter of dismay, urging that no memorial to so great a coward as Major Reno be situated on the field. In writing this, she continued, I feel almost my husband's hand taking the pen away from me. I long for a memorial to our heroes on the battlefield of the Little Bighorn, but not to single out for honor the one coward of the regiment. If she was the last to forgive, Major General Thomas Rosser, who had been Custer's roommate at West Point, surely was among the first to condemn. Only 2 days after the astounding headlines, a letter from him was published by the St. Paul Pioneer Press. I feel that Custer would have succeeded had Reno, with all the reserve of 7 companies, passed through and joined Custer after the first repulse. As a soldier, I would sooner today lie in the grave of General Custer and his gallant comrades alone in that distant wilderness, that when the last trumpet sounds I could rise to judgment from my post of duty, than to live in the place of the survivors of the siege on the hills. Everybody had an opinion. On March 8, 1879, the Army and Navy Journal reprinted a letter from the National Republican by a member of the 1st Cavalry, which said in part, "My estimate of Reno and Custer is this. The former was brave but not rash, and Custer was both. Through rashness Custer and the 3rd Cavalry Division got surrounded at Trevilian Station in 1864, and it was a brave but not a rash man who cut him out. I mean Wesley Merritt, who commanded the 1st Cavalry, of which Marcus Reno's regiment formed a part. It was Custer's rashness that got him into the scrape at the Little Bighorn in 1876, and it would require a larger force than Reno had at his command to cut him out." Another critic thought the assault failed because of Reno's timidity, because the Sioux shook their blankets at him. Years after the Major's death, a great-nephew, Charles Reno, asked that the official charges against him be re-examined. This was done, and the Judge Advocate General's office concluded that he had been improperly dismissed, which was perhaps the only bit of decent luck Reno ever had. On September 9, 1967, a unique ceremony began at the First Christian Church in Billings, Montana. Major Reno's casket, followed by the traditional riderless horse, was escorted by units of the Montana National Guard from the church to the battlefield 60 miles southeast. There the honors were presented. An 11-gun salute, signifying his Civil War brevet rank of Brigadier General, and 3 rifle volleys across his new grave. Elizabeth would have been disgusted. Although the bones of many troopers lie on the field, the only man to be buried with such pomp at the Custer National Cemetery was the one she could not abide. Now this man with the dark face rests a few steps due north of the flagpole, his rank posthumously restored, while the posthumous squabble about his cowardice goes on and on. That he was at least temporarily unsettled or incapacitated is admitted by all scholars, amateur or professional, and there are some who look upon this troubled man with the utmost virulence. Quite often those who most flagrantly despise him are career soldiers, which at first sounds like a paradox, but of course is natural. Captain R.G. Carter, for instance, himself a veteran Indian fighter of the celebrated 4th Cavalry, made this comment. Reno showed the white feather from the start, and his entire conduct was that of a white-livered, yellow-streaked coward. He was terrorized and panic-stricken. He should have been tried and cashiered for the part he took in Custer's last fight. If ever there was a pusillanimous poltroon in the army whose name should be handed down to future generations as an arrant coward, Marcus Reno is the man. Lieutenant Edward Mathy testified during the Chicago inquiry that he had heard many discussions of the fight and many opinions offered, but one expression in particular he could not forget. He did not identify the speaker, but he heard somebody say, "If we had not been commanded by a coward we would all have been killed." A religious magazine, the Northwestern Christian Advocate, assigned the blame not exactly to cowardice. What, then, was the explanation of his conduct at the Battle of the Little Bighorn? He was drunk. This is another disputed charge. Whiskey was indeed dispensed from traders' boats on the Yellowstone, along with champagne cider and such commonplace produce as butter, eggs, vegetables, pickles, lemons, licorice root, tinned salmon, chewing tobacco, shoelaces, thread, needles, etc. out of cider and bourbon. Drink was invented, christened Rosebud to honor this desolate region, and drunks were exiled to the prairie until they got over it, which probably did not take long, considering the possibility of Sioux warriors whooping over the nearest ridge. James Coleman set up shop in a tent at General Terry's base camp, a wall of canned goods separating officers and men. Prices were the same on either side. Whiskey $1 a pint, although if a soldier wanted his 3-pint canteen filled to the brim with Old Tanglefoot he needed an OK from the captain. An Arikara named Red Star said Coleman's tent was black with thirsty soldiers, like a swarm of flies. So it would have been easy enough for Major Reno to fill his canteen and numerous other containers before leaving the Yellowstone. Indeed, it would be unusual for a man who enjoyed drinking as much as he did to pass up the opportunity, especially when he knew that within a week he might lose his scalp. The ingenuity of soldiers when confronted with the problem of transporting alcohol cannot be overestimated. The most unlikely receptacles were found. Officers, more or less exempt from personal inspection, might drape a loaded goatskin across the saddle, but enlisted men were obliged to be circumspect. During the Civil War, for instance, they discovered that a rifle barrel would hold several jolts. Ulysses Grant, despite his rank, is said to have benefited from this. Indian scouts later said that some pack mules carried a little keg on either side. Curley, reputed to be the one survivor of Custer's immediate command, told his grandson that during the march up Rosebud Creek he was sent with a message to the rear of the column, and there he noticed soldiers tapping the kegs. He saw these same mules after crossing the divide, just before the attack. He said Custer halted the regiment until the mules arrived. Then the kegs were unplugged and the soldiers filed past, each man with a cup. White Man Runs Him told the same story, according to his son-in-law Robert Yellowtail. We scouts joined in. Before long my fingertips and lips tingled and felt numb. Our interpreter Mitch Bouyer explained that the whiskey was to make the soldiers brave. Lieutenant E.S. Godfrey said Reno took along a half-gallon keg and refused to share it. Godfrey's assertion cannot be verified, but it is pretty well established that Reno carried a flask obtained from some trader and was observed holding this flask in a horizontal position with his lips conjoined to the orifice. Lieutenant DeRudio came across him chatting with interpreter Gerard in the middle of the Little Bighorn where they had paused to water their horses. The major was swigging at a flask when DeRudio splashed by. "What are you trying to do?" Reno asked. "Drown me before I am killed." Gerard said that after the skirmish line collapsed he saw Reno pull out a bottle of whiskey and drink everything in it. During the Chicago inquiry, Reno admitted having a flask, but declared that he did not take a nip until long after the retreat from the valley when his battalion was marooned on the bluff. He insisted further that his 1-pint flask was not emptied until 3 days later at the site of Custer's last stand. Burying the dead was very disagreeable, he said, and he shared his pint with Captain French. The most damaging statement came from a civilian mule packer, John Frett, who got into an argument with Reno on the hilltop. Frett claimed that he had been verbally abused, quoting the major, to wit, "God damn you." In addition, said Frett, he had been physically struck in the face by the hand of the major, during which altercation the major staggered, while he, Frett, was splashed with liquor from the major's flask. Further, the major leveled a carbine at him, saying, "I will shoot you." And in this testimony Mr. Frett was supported by another civilian mule packer, Mr. B. F. Churchill. Benteen did not think the major was overloaded. He saw no indication of staggering or stammering and doubted if there was enough whiskey on the hilltop for anybody to get drunk. If he had known Reno was carrying some whiskey, he said, he would have asked for a drink himself. "I was close to him," said Private Daniel Newell, "and if he had been the least bit drunk I would have known it." Custer's orderly, John Brookman, had been detailed to the pack train on that fatal day. This hurt his feelings. So devoutly did he worship the general that he might have chosen death at Custer's side to life on Reno Hill. In any event, on the night of the 25th he was assigned to guard Major Reno's tent. He had a keg, Brookman said many years afterward, and he was drinking considerable. Brookman lived to be 88, an illiterate, gnarled, bad-tempered, childish curmudgeon with white eyebrows and a white beard, hugging jealously to himself the precious heritage of memories. Nothing else mattered to old John, and for this reason, as well as the increasing cloudiness of senility, he may have fabricated or twisted the truth. The contradictions cannot be resolved. All one might say with certainty is that the Northwestern Christian Advocate overstated the case, although Major Reno probably was not as dry as the Montana Bluff. A month later he must have been 90 proof because the Little Bighorn survivors drank copiously when they again fell into the embrace of Yellowstone traders, and according to records kept by Layton and Jordan, no member of this devastated regiment bought more booze than the man with the dark face. The names of very few enlisted men show up on L and J's accounts, maybe because they paid cash, so it is possible that some of them outdrank Reno, but among the 14 surviving officers nobody compares with him. During the first 3 weeks of August he bought 7 gallons and 2 demijohns of whiskey, which comes to about 10 quarts a week. Lieutenant Edwin P. Eckerson took second place, far behind Reno, with 3 gallons. This may indicate just how deeply the major was shocked, because an officer who customarily swallowed such an amount would not be on active duty. Eckerson's gallon a week is formidable, and becomes particularly interesting when one learns that he was not in the fight. He was on detached service at Fort Lincoln and he joined the troops on the Yellowstone after the battle. Now, there could be a number of explanations for Eckerson drinking. Perhaps he had quarreled with his wife. But he was the second lieutenant of a company wiped out at the Little Bighorn, and if he had not been assigned to duty at Fort Lincoln he would have been a dead hero. Behind Reno and Eckerson on the Layton and Jordan register one finds Captain Miles Moylan and Lieutenant George Wallace with 2 gallons apiece. Wallace bought his 2 gallons in a single day, along with some fishing tackle, so he may have been hosting a party. During this period Benteen did not buy any whiskey. At least if he did not charge it. This fact, too, says something because he liked to drink. But what his apparent abstinence means, if anything, is not clear. Quite a few Indians thought the soldiers were drunk. The Cheyenne warrior Wooden Leg said that while wandering around Custer Hill he picked up 2 metal bottles partly filled with liquid. He tasted both bottles and offered them to other Indians, none of whom knew what the liquid was until a Sioux identified it as whiskey. Wooden Leg insisted that several bottles were found on the hillside. Another Cheyenne, Bobtail Horse, pointed out to Dr. Thomas Marquis the exact spot where he found a canteen half full of whiskey. In those days Bobtail Horse did not understand whiskey, so he drank it like water and got sick. Wooden Leg's name, faintly absurd in English, does not mean he had a peg leg. It was his uncle's name, Kamokwif Sixokata, implying that he could walk all day without getting tired, whose legs therefore must be made of wood instead of flesh. The boy who later became known as Wooden Leg admired this uncle, followed him everywhere, and told his father that was what he himself would like to be called. When he was about 17 he helped to kill a Crow horse thief, and in recognition of this act his father decided the time had come. So there was a feast and the boy received his favorite uncle's name. His story about the whiskey flasks may have been contrived. He is said to have retracted it, and except for rumors there is not much to suggest a drunken regiment. If any troopers did swallow a little porcupine juice before entering the valley, it could not have been enough to disable them. Given the circumstances, approaching this enormous village of very dangerous Sioux and Cheyennes, whatever they drank must have tasted like herb tea. Reno, for example, may have taken a drink while pausing in midstream to water his horse, but his angry response to being splashed by DeRudio's horse indicates that he was stone sober. How many barking, yelping papers galloped out of Sitting Bull's camp to stop Reno's charge can only be estimated. The major himself guessed that when he withdrew from the valley there were at least 600 warriors on his left, with many more streaming from the lodges. Some historians believe that perhaps 1,000 Sioux chased him up the hill while several thousand more rode around looking for other bluecoats. Colonel W. A. Graham interviewed a number of veterans long afterward at a retirement home in Washington, and one old trooper, Sergeant Fremont Kip, said, "You take a stick and stir up a big ant hill. Stir it up good and get the ants excited and mad. Then try to count 'em." Reno was less concerned with the numerical strength, position, tactics, or weapons of the Sioux than with getting out alive. "I mounted my command and charged through the Reds in a solid body," he wrote. "As we cut our way through them, the fighting was hand to hand, and it was instant death to him who fell from his saddle. Our horses were on the dead run with, in many instances, 2 or 3 men on one animal. The surviving cavalrymen formed a ragged circle around a trough or crease in the hilltop and threw up barriers of pack saddles, blankets, bread boxes, sacks of bacon, oats, hay, whatever might deflect an arrow or a bullet. They scrabbled at the hard ground with forks, jackknives, spoons, coffee cups, mess kits and sticks, meanwhile wondering and asking aloud why Custer did not return." At the conclusion of the 1879 Chicago inquiry, the Judge Advocate General stated in his report to Secretary of War George McCrory that the feeling among Reno's troops was of anger at General Custer for having placed them in such a position. The excitement, danger, and strangeness of the situation twisted their responses. When the first bread box was dumped on the line, one of Benteen's troops immediately flung himself down behind it, but no sooner was he neatly hidden than a bullet ripped through the box and killed him. Quite a few troopers laughed. Lieutenant Godfrey wrapped himself in bedding, although he knew this was useless, and found himself wondering if sagebrush would stop bullets. A trooper of M Company, after narrowly missing death when a bullet smashed the stock of his carbine, glared at the Indians and shouted, "Damn you! You'll have to shoot better than that." Many of these enlisted men did not know how to use their weapons. Some had not once fired a carbine. Now, trapped, isolated, terrified, bewildered, they riddled the earth and the sky. Godfrey watched one recruit take aim and squeezed the trigger like a veteran. The muzzle of the gun dipped and the recruit flinched, obviously expecting a loud report, but nothing happened because he had forgotten to cock it. Late that afternoon they began to hear an unfamiliar noise. Zing! Instead of zip. When a zing-gee-gee sound came, Lieutenant Varnum wrote to Graham, "That made you take notice." What this meant was that Custer's battalion had been destroyed and the Indians now were using 7th Cavalry carbines. Thousands of arrows struck Custer's troops, yet nobody on Reno Hill mentioned arrows. Evidently the Indians used bows and arrows against Custer because they did not have much else. Later, equipped with modern US guns, very few resorted to arrows. Godfrey said the ping-ping overhead was more frightening than the swish-thud of bullets burrowing into the ground. And although it was foolish to duck, they could not prevent their bodies from twitching. Varnum remarked that Benteen was the only man he ever saw who did not try to dodge bullets. Benteen seemed oblivious to danger. He walked around checking on his troops, deliberately inviting fire, but was hurt just once when a bullet nicked his thumb. Years later, Benteen described the siege. "I state but the facts when I say that we had a fairly warm time with those red men. The day was cloudy," Lieutenant Wallace remembered. "The sun went down as a red ball. That night the valley was scored by intermittent flashes of heat lightning which illuminated the hostile encampment, yet even in darkness the pattern of the great village could be distinguished by the light of thousands of campfires. Some of Reno's men slept, others must have spent the night awake, horrified and fascinated, as they listened to the barking dogs and the howls of dancing savages. The troops on the hilltop assumed these Indians were celebrating, but much of the noise was a lament for their dead. Howls of joy did mingle with the dolorous concert, and jubilant dances erupted as warriors visited one demonstration after another, reciting their exploits and being hailed accordingly. But the mourning period among these tribes was 4 days, and there could be no formal celebration until the stricken relatives consented. Sioux fighting men cropped their hair as a sign of grief. Cheyennes untied their long braids. Women of both tribes gashed themselves with shards of flint, and many of them amputated part of a finger. Custer was appalled by this practice of self-mortification. The amputation of fingers especially disgusted him. In his autobiography, My Life on the Plains, he wrote that they would chop off the first joint without regard for the principles of surgery, often using a dull knife. As a result, when the flesh healed it withdrew and left almost an inch of bone exposed, a condition he found most revolting. Large fires visible from the hilltop were not victory bonfires as the soldiers thought. The Sioux, although not the Cheyennes, cremated some of their dead, and these towers of flame were burial lodges. And what the soldiers heard very often was a dirge, accompanied by improvised kill songs. At that time the Indians did not realize they had fought Custer. They had defeated a bluecoat army, that was all they knew. Later, when they found out, they sang about him. David Humphreys Miller transcribed one such kill song. Longhair has never returned, so his woman is crying, crying, looking over this way, she cries. Longhair, horses I had none. You brought me many and I thank you. You make me laugh. Longhair, guns I had none. You brought me many. The shrieks and wails, whether of elation or sorrow, were easily heard on the heights across the river, and shadows capering like demons around innumerable fires lured imaginative soldiers to the edge of madness. Private James Pym believed he saw renegade whites circling the rifle pits and shouting insults, challenging the troopers to come out. He thought these renegades carried the Little Swallowtail Company flags called guidons, and when Reno's bugler blew calls they would be exactly repeated, meaning there must be a white bugler with the Indians. Other men saw columns of soldiers approaching and distinctly heard the commands of officers. Guns were fired to guide these rescuers, and a trumpeter blew stable call. They wondered aloud about the identity of these troops. Godfrey said every opinion was ratified with a cheer. Somebody thought it must be Crook's army, so one of the packers jumped on a horse and galloped around the hill shouting, "Don't be discouraged, boys. Crook is coming." 2 surgeons, James DeWolf and Henry Porter, had accompanied Reno's battalion into the valley. DeWolf was killed while scrambling up the bluff. Followed by his orderly, Private Elihu Clear, he thought he could make better time by following a ravine 200 or 300 yards north of the one used by most of the men during the retreat. Today, looking down this brush-choked ravine from the top of Reno Hill, it is difficult to imagine why DeWolf chose it. But he did, and there they caught him. Nearby troopers saw an Indian take his scalp. He seems to have been congenitally unfortunate, rather like Major Reno. During the Civil War he volunteered for the Union Army, and by the age of 17 he had been shot, discharged, and pensioned. In 1865 he somehow managed to enlist as a regular and became a hospital steward, meanwhile attending Harvard Medical School. Although he obtained an M.D. from Harvard, he could not pass the Army Medical Board examination and was discharged for the second time in 1875. He then contracted to serve the Army as a private physician in the Department of Dakota. He wrote constantly to his wife after leaving Fort Lincoln. He enjoyed the march and was anticipating a pleasant time in the field. He had brought along rubber leggings and a coat in the event of rain, and in his valise was a quart of whiskey. An enlisted man had been assigned to set up his tent, make his bed, saddle his horse, and otherwise relieve him of diurnal chores. Reno, who commands my wing, I cannot like, but suppose acquaintance will improve perhaps when we understand each other, he wrote, adding that he did like the adjutant, Benny Hodgson. Well, darling, he concludes, my letters may be far between after this, but I shall write every opportunity and will try and keep a memoranda of the incidents. 3 days out he admonishes her not to worry because he is perfectly safe. He doubts they will see an Indian all summer, but he carries a revolver and a carbine, just in case. The regiment had an easy march that day, and he thinks he will like General Custer, who appears very fashionable and narby in a buckskin suit. On May 22nd he reports that he sees quite a lot of Reno, who is often left in command because Terry and Custer like to ride a mile or so ahead. Only a few troopers have fallen sick, though it is wet and dreary. I had a nice sponge bath tonight and changed all my clothes and feel nice and took a nasty pill. Well, darling, as I have to get up at 2:30 or 3 a.m. tomorrow, I must retire, and it is getting chilly as I have taken off my flannel. Next day they marched only 8 miles. For dinner there was soup and roasted antelope rib. The band has just struck up Don't You Wish You Was Along. It is nice when the weather is fair and the march is short, but my nose and ears are nearly burned off. I am trying glycerine and alum. No Indians yet or signs. A note dated the 27th mentions that they have reached the Badlands. The days are getting pretty hot and the horses get stuck up with wild in cactus, and then don't they bound. June 1st. When he awoke at 3 a.m. the ground was white. All day it snowed. He found a stretcher to use as a bedstead, built a fire at the entrance to his tent, and felt cozy except for ashes and smoke blowing in. June 2nd. Still bivouacked, unable to move because of snow squalls. I suppose when you get this we will be near ready to turn back. Hoping so, darling. I expect we shall be in by August 15th or 29th, darling, from your loving husband. June 8th. Camped beside the powder, he writes again that his nose and ears are about to fall off and laughing is impossible, but he feels fine. The troops are enjoying venison steak, beans, bacon, biscuits with butter, apple pudding, and coffee. He expects to get home soon. June 21st. At the mouth of Rosebud Creek. I think it is very clear that we shall not see an Indian this summer. The post trader or John Smith has opened his whiskey and see, and of course you all know what will follow. It is believed that the Indians have scattered and gone back to their reservations. Yesterday I went out with Dr. Porter, Lieutenant Harrington, and Hodgson pistol shooting and came out second best. Porter was best, so you see some of the cavalry cannot shoot very well. Rosebud Creek takes its name by being profusely bordered by the wild roses like those of Warner. I send you one in this letter. Well, darling, I must close this as the boat moves down the river some little distance and the mail closes tonight. Your loving hub, J. M. DeWolf. There seems to be only one photograph of him. A bald young man with dark, patient eyes and a drooping mustache. He looks as though he has just received bad news. His body was not mutilated, probably because he lay close to the Reno line of defense. His diary, which was picked up by Dr. Porter, contains one entry of unusual significance. Some days earlier, before the Sioux had been located, General Terry dispatched Reno on a scouting sortie with a horse-drawn Gatling gun for protection. Dr. DeWolf accompanied Reno and, as usual, kept a record of events. He notes that at one point the Gatling overturned, injuring 3 men. Later, just before the 7th rode away from Terry's command for the last time, Custer was offered the use of several Gatlings but rejected them. Just why he declined this clumsy, frightening artillery will never be known. He said the guns would impede his march, which was true. But DeWolf's diary reveals that not only were they awkward, they were dangerous. As for the other surgeon, Dr. Porter, he managed to scramble out of the valley, and the first thing he said to Reno on the hilltop was, "Major, the men were pretty well demoralized, weren't they?" "No," Reno answered, "that was a charge, sir." Not only did Dr. Porter survive this uncommon charge, he survived 2 days on the hilltop, and he lived a long time after. He spent his last years traveling about the world in a gentlemanly manner, and he died at the Hotel Metropole in Agra, India, where he had gone to view the Taj. On a bluff overlooking the Little Bighorn, clad in a white linen duster, he worked heroically throughout the night, operating by touch because the light of a candle or even the quick flare of a match invited a murderous shower. Despite what he was doing, aware that nobody else could do it, Dr. Porter grew discontented with his role. He felt that he should contribute more to the defense. Several times he snatched up a rifle and started for the firing line, turning back only because his patients loudly objected. That anybody could work under these conditions sounds preposterous, but frontier surgeons acquired skills not taught in medical school. They learned, for instance, to distinguish the arrows of each tribe by their structural characteristics and dimensions. This knowledge might be enough to save a man's life. By measuring how much of the shaft was exposed, a surgeon could tell how deeply the head was buried, and by feeling the bowstring notch he could determine the angle of the blade. Thus, even in darkness, he knew what to expect. The most difficult wounds to treat were caused not by bullets or flint arrowheads but arrowheads cut from the white man's sheet iron. These iron triangles very often bent or clinched when they struck bone, making extraction brutally painful. Surgeons of that era used a technique devised by Dr. J. H. Bill, which consisted of inserting a looped wire and manipulating it until the loop engaged the arrowhead, whereupon the shaft and the head together could, with luck, be pulled out. This seldom happened unless the victim was treated promptly because the animal tendons that bound the head to the shaft would soften and loosen. Besides, many Indians deliberately weakened the binding so that even if a soldier or homesteader managed to withdraw the shaft, the blade would remain inside. Either way, lucky or not, in a field hospital with no chloroform, the removal of an arrow must have been excruciating. Abdominal wounds usually were fatal, whether or not the blade could be withdrawn. This fact being known to Indians, they frequently aimed at a soldier's belly button, and it is said that experienced frontiersmen sometimes would wrap a blanket around their middle in hopes of stopping the point or at least diminishing the impact. Dr. Bill went so far as to recommend that soldiers be equipped with an abdominal cuirass. These wounds were deadly because of peritonitis. Still, it might not have been a bad way to go. An 1885 publication from the U.S. government printing office entitled The Soldier's Handbook, authored by a loyal bureaucrat, Mr. N. Herschler, who sounds like the natural ancestor of today's foggy bottom flax, contrives to make peritonitis sound almost pleasant, no worse than radiation sickness. The person lives a day or two, with perfect clearness of intellect, and often not suffering greatly. June 26th, their second day in purgatory, broke cloudy with a few spatters of rain. Troopers scurried around setting up kettles, buckets, stretching lengths of canvas, holding out tin cups, anything to catch water. But the clouds evaporated, the sun blazed on the hilltop, and Indians down below were setting grass fires either to conceal their movements or to prevent soldiers from approaching the river. Some of Reno's men were willing to face whatever must be faced. Others began to wilt. One man who disintegrated had to be tied up like a hog. Some got so thirsty that they punched holes in tins of fruit and sucked the juice, a forbidden practice because nobody knew how long the siege might last and everything must be conserved. Private Peter Thompson said the offers by wounded men were pitiful. $10 for one drink of water, $15 for a canteen, $20 for a canteen, as though it was an auction. A man by the name of McVeigh, to whom I handed the canteen that he might drink, seemed determined to keep it in his possession. I jerked it from his grasp and passed it on to the next. With a cry of rage he drew his revolver from beneath his overcoat and taking aim at me he told me to skip. McVeigh later was shot in the stomach. He begged continuously for water, offering $75 for a drink, and finally got it. The water trickled through the hole in his stomach, said Private Daniel Newell, but he laid back and died in peace. PVTS James Tanner and Henry Voigt were buried that morning. Tanner had been hit outside the line. 4 men dashed out, rolled him in a blanket, and brought him back, but he soon died. Voigt was trying to lead a horse that had been shot in the head when his own brains were scattered. These 2 privates were laid in one grave and covered with dirt, their names penciled on a board pried from a bread box. F.C. Mann, a mule packer, was seen aiming his carbine. He held the position steadily, as a good marksman does, but he neglected to pull the trigger. At last somebody went to investigate and found a hole in his temple. Chief Mule Packer J.C. Wagoner also got a bullet in the skull. He kicked and flopped around, evidently done for. But it had been a long-distance shot, the bullet was nearly spent, and he surprised everybody by sitting up. Sergeant Charles White had brought a glass of jelly in one of his saddlebags and he walked around giving each wounded soldier a taste of jelly, though he himself was shot in the elbow. An aesthetic problem developed. Dead horses were beginning to stink, and whenever a bullet punctured a bloated carcass everybody close by would be splashed with putrefying flesh. Glistening carrion beetles arrived to sample this prodigious feast. Tiny white maggots squirmed blindly in the corruption. Vultures hung lazily overhead. But worst of all was the dehydration. Scout George Herendeen told of men with swollen tongues, of some who could hardly talk. They would try to eat crackers or hardtack but could not raise enough saliva. Several tried grass, but it stuck to their lips, and no one could spit or speak plainly. The wounded were reported dying from want of water. Now and then a black-feathered head rising cautiously above a bush would be blown apart by a fusillade, although usually it was a feathered coup stick or a mat of buffalo hair draped on a gun barrel. Reno's inexperienced men also wasted ammunition trying to kill a buckskin suit stuffed with grass which the Indians tied to a pony. Private Coleman occasionally got the dates mixed in his marvelous journal, but that should be overlooked in such a dramatic story. The Indians opened a murderous fire on us with their long-range Winchester rifle, and one of our men got killed and 2 badly wounded. We had now been 22 hours without water and we were suffering very much for the want of it, especially the wounded. It was almost impossible for a man to go to the river without getting killed. In 1877 a number of forked sticks were found on distant slopes, and it is believed these sticks were used by Indian sharpshooters to cradle their guns, a trick they learned from watching professional buffalo hunters. Several ambitious braves wriggled to within a few yards of the line. How anybody, even a skillfully camouflaged Indian, could have crept almost to the skirmish line without being detected is hard to imagine because there is not much ground cover on Reno Hill, not near the top. A century ago the brush might have grown higher and thicker. Still, it is surprising. Some Indians got close enough to throw clods of dirt at the soldiers, and a Sanzart named Long Robe counted coup on a man he killed, an act of bravado which cost his own life. Reno mentions it in an official report. When I say the stick was only 10 or 12 feet long, some idea of the desperate and reckless fighting of these people may be understood. Long Robe and an Unkpapa named Hawk Man may have been the only Indians killed during this 2-day siege, although in 1923 ex-Private Edwin Picard told a journalist that he had watched a hand-to-hand struggle between an unidentified sergeant and a Big Sioux. The sergeant grabbed the Indian's scalp lock, forced his head back and sank his teeth into the warrior's throat. They rolled around and around, the sergeant chewing away like a bulldog until he managed to chew open an artery. Then he broke the Indian's neck. There is no corroborative evidence of hand-to-hand fighting on the hilltop, and very few historians think much of Picard's story. Whether or not it happens to be true, there is no doubt that the proximity of the Indians was alarming. They got so close that Benteen was afraid a sudden rush might breach the defense. He therefore told Reno that a squad must be assembled to charge the nearest hostiles and drive them back. Reno hesitated. Reno's uncertainty or timidity seems beyond dispute. Lieutenant Godfrey, having discussed this critical situation with Captain Weir, noted in his diary, "We both thought that to Colonel Benteen we must look for the wisdom to deliver us." As it was evident that Colonel Reno carried no vigor or decision, and his personal behavior gave no confidence in him. Godfrey was present when Benteen recommended the charge. He heard Benteen say with obvious annoyance, "You've got to do something here pretty quick. This won't do, you must drive them back." Reno at last consented. Benteen collected a few volunteers, planted himself in front and braced them with a speech that might have sounded natural in 1876 but today sounds ludicrous. "All ready now, men. Now's your time. Give them hell. Hip, hip, here we go." Off they went with a loud hurrah, every man, but one who lay in his pit crying like a child. Hip, hip, hurrah! Every man jack except that coward. It is straight from the pages of a Victorian adventure book. This weeping trooper was not alone. Others behaved badly. Some acquired nicknames they would never lose. Crackerbox Dan spent 2 days behind a crackerbox. Aparejo Mickey, possibly a reference to Captain Miles Moylan, hid behind a pack saddle. And according to John Brookman, young Billy Blake pretended to be hurt so he would not have to fight. They were good soldiers, Brookman adds, but the panic in the valley had emptied their heads. Private Peter Thompson saw a man from a company lying motionless, face down, apparently dead. 2 soldiers dragging a piece of canvas with which they meant to build a shelter for the wounded told him to get out of the way. He did not move. One of them kicked him and he struggled to his feet, insisting that he was sick. "A more miserable-looking wretch it would be difficult to find," says Thompson. The man was almost frightened to death. He walked a few steps and fell to the ground, heedless to the heat of the sun or anything else going on around him. Lieutenant Edgerly wrote to his wife that a D Company trooper, Private Patrick Golden, did everything he was supposed to on the first day, but that night after the firing stopped he asked a sergeant if the Indians would return. The sergeant guessed they would return in the morning. Golden then began to cry, and he said, "Tom, if they come back they will kill me." There are 2 other accounts of Golden's behavior, very different, but Edgerly's is considered the most reliable. "Next morning," he said, when he and Private Steins came to a large rifle pit, with Golden alone in the middle of it. Steins asked, "Paddy, whose hole is this?" Golden didn't know, and because everybody else was hiding in a pit, Edgerly and Steins threw themselves down next to him, one on either side. Moments later, a bullet streaked through the crest of the pit, showering them with dirt, and struck Golden. He groaned once, Edgerly wrote, pushed with his right foot, and was dead. Other men fought bravely at first, like Golden, but after a while grew timid. Others, for reasons known only to themselves, behaved just the opposite. Benteen's berserk charge turned out to be a spectacular success. The closest warriors fled from these savage bluecoats, not one of whom was injured. But then, just as they got back to the pits, a bullet hit the weeping coward between the eyes. Presumably he was hit by an Indian bullet, although some enraged member of Benteen's squad may have murdered him. The captain's view of this absurd charge, which he called the Chinese Act, is neither idealistic nor heroic. He was a pragmatic man. He understood the psychological effect of noise, so he instructed his volunteers to shout. And the astonished warriors fell head over heels in their efforts to escape. Not long afterward, Benteen was inspecting the line when a sergeant raised his head and a bullet knocked off his hat. "Damn you," Benteen said, "I told you to keep down." The sergeant grinned and said, "Why don't you keep down, Captain?" Benteen, who referred to his wife as Mother, said, "Oh, I'm all right. Mother sewed some good medicine in my blouse before I left home, so they won't get me." Enlisted men usually become exasperated when an officer exposes himself to the enemy because it draws fire, but again and again we are told by troopers who served with Benteen on the hill that his conviction of immortality reassured them. Although the day was hot, he never rested. Back and forth he went, giving advice, examining bulwarks, encouraging the troops. His shirt tail had worked out of his pants and hung over his rump like a flag while he tramped around saying, "This is a groundhog case, men. It is live or die. We must fight it out."